Reading from the Gospel of Luke. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' The manager said to himself, 'What will I do, now that my master has taken the position away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do, so that when I am dismissed as manager, people will welcome me into their homes.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'How much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you with the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all this, and they ridiculed him. So he said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves in the sight of others, but God knows your heart. For what is prized by human beings is an abomination in the sight of God."
Only once in my many years have I ever stood up in the middle of worship and walked out of church. I've been tempted to a number of times, but only once. We were guests out there in the wilds of the Midwest. The text was the text of the morning. The reading was exactly the reading that was shared with us. And the minister walked into the box, into the pulpit, looked at the congregation and said what Jesus meant to say. And I turned to my bride and said, "We're out of here." This is a difficult story. I hope you heard it, and I hope you will take the bulletin home and read it again. It's an extremely difficult story. But it's an important story because it raises a very critical truth that we dare not avoid. The 8th verse. The end of the story that Jesus tells us about the master, the owner of the field with the dishonest steward. The master commended the dishonest steward for his shrewdness. And then we have Jesus' commentary, which is, for those of the world out there are wiser in their generation than the children of the light. Us. Rare is the week. Rare is the week where there's not some kind of news about a misuse of money, a misappropriation, a sliding, a slickness around dollars. Sometimes it's stupidity. Sometimes it's just innate dishonesty. But it occurs again and again and again. Whether it's that caregiver up in Sebastian who plays fast and loose with the employer's checkbook, or the 3 mayors south of us in Florida cities who now have been indicted for taking envelopes from contractors Whether it's the Ponzi schemes that rise up and fall away, it's all of those things that have become very, very familiar and almost ordinary for us. Temptation and opportunity driven by avarice, always coming out the same. And it's all so familiar. Therefore, Jesus' story should be a fairly comfortable fit, shouldn't it? Jesus' story this morning about the dishonest steward kind of fits in that box, except that we don't expect Jesus to talk that way. And we don't expect him to tell us a story, and that's what it is. It's not an allegory. There's no distinguishing of characters here. The man who owns the business is not God. This is a story. And so consequently, what we hear is a story of the real world. The story of a dishonest steward. And I would argue that this is a very authentic story. Authentic meaning that it really, really was told by Jesus. And told by Jesus the way we have it. And you can tell that for two reasons. First of all, it only shows up in Luke. It's not there in Matthew and in Mark. Now, Matthew and Luke have a whole lot of Mark in them, as you probably know, a very high percentage. But then there are traditions. There are absolutely other traditions that feed into the gospel stories. And this is one of them. And this was a remembered story by the community that Luke was writing to. And we can tell for two reasons. First of all, it's a very brisk story. It really wants for adverbs and adjectives. And the first time a story is told, that's the way it comes out, right? By the third telling, it has now been developed and extrapolated. So, the absence of all of those adverbs and adjectives tell us that this is very close to the original telling. And secondly, it's counterintuitive. Absolutely counterintuitive. It doesn't fit the mold of the religious tale. It transcends time and tradition. It goes well beyond the limitations of culture and condition. It's a story of truth. Absolute truth. A Swiss theologian was very, very fond of saying, the only reason you and I show up here on a Sunday morning is that we want to deal with truth. Really, really deal. And so Jesus tells us a very, very truthful story, which is somewhat difficult to hear. There is this steward, he who is the major domo, who cooked the books. He's a person who took care of himself as well as taking care of his master. Now you have to understand, in the first century, the position of steward was absolutely special. The steward wore a symbol. He wore a symbol either around his neck or at his waist. He wore a key. The key was the key that allowed him into every piece and part of his master's ownings. Now that transitions to modern time. If you go to a very upscale restaurant, you don't get a wine list. You get a person. That person is the wine list. And when she or he comes to you and you look at them, and they're called, New York Times crossword puzzle, sommeliers, what do they have around their necks? A key. When you go into a Roman Catholic church next time and you look to the left, the American flag is going to be to the right, your American flag is going to be to the left. You look on the flag that is sitting there, and the flag is essentially gold with a white insert, and inside the white insert is a crest, but around the crest are three keys. The Pope's flag. The Pope who has the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Remember that line? So now you know what Jesus was talking about. You and I have the keys to the kingdom of heaven, not only the Pope. And therefore, we are the stewards of the kingdom. Well, the steward was the one who was in charge. And he operated with a very critical element, a very core value. He operated with trust. Everything was by trust. But isn't that true for everything? If I'm going to have any kind of connection with you, any kind of connection of value, it is built not upon my winsomeness, and not my cleverness. It's built upon trust between the two of us. Trust is the critical relationship in all of life. That I trust you and you trust me. Intriguingly, I have a wedding in November. Yesterday I met with the couple for the second time. If I happen to do your wedding, it costs you 3 counseling sessions. That's all it costs you. But you have homework. You really have to work hard. And the homework for yesterday was, think of the 5 most important things in your life, list them in order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 being the most important, cross out 4 and 5, and give me what you bring back. Because those are core values, and that's how you make your decisions, that's how you make your connections. And for both of them, they've known each other for a while, they're living together, they have a sense of themselves. For both of them, without talking about this ahead of time, because that's the rule, the number 1 item they gave me was trust. So, the steward breaks trust. He breaks trust and he is confronted. And when he is confronted, he knows he's going to lose the job because those folk are right behind the owner and they're going to do an inventory. And so in order to soften the blow, he says, I'm going to find a place out there in the world, and where I'm fired from here, I'm going to be taken in there. He uses a wonderful line. Perhaps you caught it. It should be the maximum, the motto of the AARP. I am too old to dig, too proud to beg. Isn't that wonderful? And so what does he do? He goes to the people that are debtors. And he says to the first group, well, why don't you just cut the bill by 50%? And to the second one, cut it by 1/5. And those are the people that are going to welcome me. And when the owner in Jesus' story, when he hears this, he doesn't do what you and I would do. He commends the unfaithful steward. And he says to him, you were really clever. You were really shrewd. You were really sophisticated. And then Jesus' commentary to that is that those of the world are wiser in their generation than those of the light. Now, Jesus is many things, as you well know. He has many roles. Jesus is a preacher, and he's a prophet. He's a healer. He's a charismatic. He's a founder of a religious sect which is a bit countercultural. But most of all, Jesus is a wisdom teacher. He's a teacher of truth. And wisdom teachers do not teach with sermons or lectures, be it known. Wisdom teachers primarily use stories. Because it's expected by a wisdom teacher that stories will convey what needs to be conveyed. And so the wisdom teacher provides the conveyance. The interpretation is on the hero, on us. And so Jesus tells this story so that you and I will have an insight in what it is to be a believer. Jesus says very clearly that those of the world out there where you and I live and do most of our business are wiser than we are. And Jesus says that's not the way it's supposed to be. Jesus says very, very clearly, and you and I need to hear this, that naivety, simplicity are impediments. They are a sea anchor to stern in terms of the faith. And Jesus uses money as a motif. because it is a very common thing. Money is the means by which Jesus conveys the whole setting for what he wants us to know. A very intriguing study was issued 2 weeks ago. It was done by a major American university using an N of 1,800 people, 1,800 middle-class people. And the question was, what would hurt you more, a spouse who cheated on you or one who lied about money? And 1/4 of the respondents said the one who lied about money. You see, money is a thing that works at two levels. It becomes a means of getting what we want, a commodity. But money itself functions on trust, doesn't it? A dollar bill does not have an intrinsic value of $1. A dollar bill is worth $1 because you and I have faith in the government of the United States. Now, in many events, we don't trust the government of the United States as far as we can see them. But in terms of money, we trust totally and completely. And so Jesus is talking about the fact of what happens in this story is so very critical. A steward becomes dishonest. And yet, because of the means by which he personally deals with his dishonesty, there is something in that that's raised up for us. And the question that is given to us, I think very clearly, is what could happen if believers, you and I, if we were as clever pursuing kingdom things, justice and mercy and forgiveness and restoration, as those who look out for themselves? What would happen? Somewhere in the very fabric of the church, almost from the beginning of the beginning, there is this sense of us being out of the world. Jesus says very clearly we're to be in the world, but not of the world. Most of the time, we're neither. Most of the time, our faith has very, very little to do with how the world works. And we seem to think that for whatever reason, we are to be absent from the processes of the world that's ours. In the history of the church, the monastic movement is part of that. That's the withdrawal. That the world is awful and going to hell in a handbasket, and we are not to be part of that. And yet the gospel says just the opposite. The gospel says you and I are God's change agents. Or what I wrote in the prayer this morning, we are God's commandos for good. We're the ones in the front ranks. We're the ones first on the beach. We're the ones at the head of the column. We are the ones that lead the attack for that which is right and just and true. Naivety is not a virtue, it's a vice. Simplicity is not a thing we ever want to evidence. Jesus' expectation is that you and I will be as sophisticated as we possibly can. We might even be suave and debonair, but we have to be sophisticated if we are going to deal with the world. We need to be emboldened. We need to be square-shouldered. We need to be able to look the world directly in the eye and to challenge, to deal, and to do. Not on the world's terms, but with the sophistication that the world evidences. Where does it happen? Well, it happens in the everyday. The everyday of every day. An American poet has written, what really happens of importance in this world happens where the lines between the worlds are thinnest. The world of the kingdom and the world of the world, where those two things a butt with one another. It's a lesson to be learned. And we learn it in many ways and in many places. I learned the lesson long ago. After 6 years in the Navy, I was selected with two other chaplains, to do a postgraduate program to earn another degree, a second degree. I chose Duke University. Duke University was the one place I could go where if I attended an academic year from September to May, I could get the degree if I did the coursework and the dissertation and the orals. My major was ethics. A Navy chaplain with proceed orders to Vietnam. My mentor was the leading ethicist in the United States in those days. And for those 8.5 months that I was at Duke, it was very difficult. A Navy chaplain, committed to a system mentored by a leading ethicist who also happened to be a conscientious objector. We worked through the year. Classes were oftentimes challenging. The campus was in ferment. When I graduated, I walked through 2,000 students who were protesting the war. Did all my coursework, finished the requirements the day before graduation. My mentor called me in the office and he said, "You're on the way, and I want to tell you a story." He said, "In 1943, I graduated from Connecticut Wesleyan, a conscientious objector. 1943. And I decided that I couldn't stay home. And so he went into the Army and became an enlisted corpsman, but refused to carry a weapon. In the Battle of the Bulge, he won a Silver Star for courage, the third highest award we have for courage. And he said to me, "You're going to go to Vietnam, and I expect that you will do well, but this may be the last time we ever see each other." And then he gave me his blessing, and he said, "The only advice I'm going to give you is, Bob, never forget who you work for. Never forget who you work for." 13 months later, having put 58 Marines in body bags, I came home. And I came home knowing full well at that moment, and have never forgotten, that our task in the world is to stand up to evil, to deal with those things that are wrong, to bring grace to those who are graceless, and love to those who are loveless, but to be there with them. To be in that world in totality. To be as sophisticated, as debonair, as grown, as wise, as clever as that world out there. And to be willing to pay the price. To live in a world where there are broken fingernails and torn trousers. Because that's the world that Jesus saved and calls upon us to be living witnesses to. That's the gospel for the day. And when you and I leave this place in a matter of 18 minutes, we're going to have a wonderful chance to try it all out. The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with us all, and the people say together,